Arabi, a member of the Yemen Peace Forum. I welcome you to this seminar, which is held as part of the Transitional Justice Week in Yemen from August 29 to September 2nd. This is a part of the work of the Transitional Justice Team at the Yemen Peace Forum, a program of the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies to foster dialogue, reflection, and joint action to raise the voice of transitional justice in Yemen, and to affirm our message that there can be no secure future without providing justice for victims and guaranteeing dignity and rights for all. Ladies and gentlemen, the specter of enforced disappearance has long been a part of Yemeni's collective memory from the 1960s and even possibly before that until the outbreak of the ongoing war. This includes the conflict between the Republicans and the Royalists, the post-revolution period, the events of January 1986 in the south, and the 1994 civil war, and the subsequent campaigns of persecution and violations, and up to the recent years, which have seen a new surge in conflict with multiple armed parties since 2014. This legacy of violations has made transitional justice and the preservation of collective memory more important than ever. Our session today will focus on two main themes. The first theme will be the efforts of civil society organizations in transitional justice issues using the Transitional Justice Declaration as a case study, and the lawyer and the human rights activist Samah Subay will speak on this topic. The second theme will be on the role of journalism and the arts in preserving the memory of victims, and the journalist and writer Alawi Al-Saqaf will speak on this theme. I would also like to inform our audience that simultaneous interpretation is available in both English and Arabic. And the floor is open for your questions and comments. You can write them in the Q&A box in Zoom. We will start with Mr. Alawi Al-Saqaf, a writer and journalist. Mr. Alawi, based on your own personal experience, as you have an important story regarding enforced disappearance, and we hope that you can share it with us briefly. From there, could you tell us more about how journalism and the arts have managed to unveil these violations and how they work to document the memory of victims, both in the Yemeni context and from other experiences? Over to you, Alawi. Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you for the introduction. And I would like to thank the Yemen Peace Forum and the Sana'a Center for this invitation to speak in this seminar and specifically on this topic. In the beginning, earlier, I had decided to talk about some relevant concepts like memory and conscience, and how the arts and journalism connect with the two, and how journalism and the arts have an important role in documenting a collective memory and in supporting the victims of enforced disappearance, while working to show the suffering that they go through, as well as the suffering of their families, as their families are victims of these violations as well. And during this intervention, I would have also mentioned an experience that I personally had. But during the meeting that we had to prepare for this session, Mrs. Bilqis Al-Lahabi told me that my story and my experience can present all of these points, and that I should focus my intervention on this and not leave it as a marginal topic. And I thank her for that, and I think she is correct. And so I will start with my own personal experience. Well, sorry, before going into that experience, I wanted to mention, I think we all remember the experience that I will present will primarily be focused on victims in both of the countries that made up Yemen before unification, the North and the South, and how this continued up until 2007, and then how it shifted in 2013. And I think these 2 years, 2007 and 2013, will become clear why I chose them during my intervention. The experience that I wanted to start with in 1990, while all of us were very happy about unification of North and South Yemen, I remember the speeches given by both Alis, Ali Abdullah Saleh and Ali Salim Al-Bid at the time. And there were there was significant grassroots support, and there were many people who had gathered, and both of the leaders were speaking very excitedly. And they mentioned during their speeches that they will work to close all and resolve all of the files of the past. And I remember it very clearly that when they said this, everyone clapped and we were all yelling and screaming out of happiness because we believed all of these cases from the past will be resolved. And I think we were idiots, honestly. We were clapping as if we were the perpetrators, that closing these case files is what we wanted or was our demand. And that this would be a gift to us, the people, of closing these files. Whereas they were not resolved, they were not dealt with, but they were closed in order to protect the identities of the perpetrators of these crimes, the perpetrators who have committed crimes against many, many victims. And this was the first incident that I wanted to mention. I will also go into my own personal experience, something that happened to me. It will, all I knew about him at the time was that he was all that I knew about him at the time was that he was a young journalist from Ib named Muhammad, and that he had been killed in the Dar al-Bashair detention center in Sana'a while under torture. In 1982, when I was a high school student, my father was detained by the regime in Sana'a, and in the first month of his detention, which continued for a whole year, he was forcibly disappeared, and we had no idea where he was being held. And this led to us looking for going from one prison to another to try to find where my father was being held. And these were the prisons of what was called the National Security Bureau in Sana'a. And there were several prisons that were under the control of the National Security Bureau. And we would go from one prison to another to try to find them. And we would even go to other prisons under other entities like the Central Security Forces. And it was known that the National Security Bureau prisons were in the main headquarters of the Bureau in Hadda. And there were also a very dark detention center in the Al-Bashair, which had a horrible reputation. And there was another one of the palaces located in Al-Bonia and Old Sana'a that was a palace during the time of the Imam that also contained a detention center used by national security. And so I remember going from prison to prison to try to find where my father was being held. And at that time, the burden of trying to find my father, due to us being young, there were 6 of us, the oldest being disabled and unable to go out, 3 being in high school, and 1 in middle school, and the other in elementary school. And so my mom was the one burdened with finding him. And my mom would, during her search for my father, she would find many other relatives outside of the doors of the prisons, looking for their sons, their brothers, their husbands. And there were many people there, the elderly, older mothers, even young wives, and all of them were there to try to find their missing relatives. In 1982 was actually one of the biggest waves of detentions by the regime in Sana'a before unification. And at that time, they had been able to infiltrate the leftist parties by the regime, and they were able to arrest members of these parties in all of the main cities. Among those families who were looking for their relatives was a family from Ib who were looking for their son who had been detained. And these families, including the family from Ib, all of the answers that they received from the prison authorities was that there would be denial that these individuals were actually being held there. And after more than a month, and after discovering that my father was being held in the Dar al-Bashair detention center, we were actually one of the lucky few that were allowed to visit him. After a few days, my father was transferred to the central prison, and in the central prison, things were a lot better. Whenever we would see my father, he would not be shackled, because when we would visit him in Dar al-Bashair, all of the detainees were shackled, and chained, and it would be tied all the way up to their necks using a rope.
أبي استخدم يبدو هو كان يلبس كرافتة استخدم كرافتته
And
في حمل تلك
my father, because
تلك
he
الثقالات.
used to wear a tie, he would
كنا
use his tie
أثناء
to
الزيارات
try to
نكثر
decrease the load. And during our visits to him,
جوارب الأرجل لأنه كان
we would bring
لكي
as many socks as we could to my father
عشان القيد لا يعور
so that he would
الساق
have some padding
والكاحل.
so that the chains on his ankles and his legs would
المهم
not hurt
أثناء
him.
زيارتنا لأبي في
But during our visit to my
السجن
father
المركزي وقلت
in the
السجن
central
المركزي
prison,
كان الأمور خفيفة كنا
and like I
نجلس
said,
نتحدث معه
in the
كان
central
أسبوعيا
prison, things
بالزيارة
were a
وكنا
lot
نجلس
better.
نتحدث
There
معه
was a
وهو
weekly
خلف
visit where we would
في
be able
سبت
to meet with him.
فصل بيننا بين الزوار
There was
وبين
a
وبين المساجين.
metal fence between the visitors and
في أحد
the
تلك
inmates,
الأحاديث
but we would be able to talk to him through this
سألته
barrier.
أمي يبدو
During
كان
one of
معها
our
في تلك
discussions, I asked my mother, and I think she still remembered that very old man and his wife and the family who had come from Ib to look for their son, a young journalist from Ib named Muhammad. And so she asked my father about this young man, and he was quiet for a little bit, and then he looked up, and I could see a painful look on his face, and he said, "These dogs have killed him," while they were interrogating him. So while they were torturing this young man during the interrogation, they killed him. For me, this was a very painful experience. The fact that we were the ones to receive this news was a very difficult experience. And for me, over a quarter century, almost exactly 25 years, I wanted to try to find the name of that young man, the young journalist who was killed under torture during his detention. And I would ask people, especially my friends who were from the leftist parties, and at that time I was affiliated with the leftist party, especially during my university years. And I would ask people insistently, anyone that I could find. Whenever I would find someone who might have been detained or know someone that was detained, I would ask them about a young journalist from Ib who was killed while he was being tortured in the Dar al-Bashair detention center. But unfortunately, despite my efforts, I was unable to get an answer. And this whole search was fruitless. And this continued for a long time. Like I said, almost 25 years, I continued to pursue this. And in 2007, the Al-Nida newspaper started publishing on the enforced disappearance. And I personally believe that this was one of the most important reports published by a Yemeni newspaper up until now, and it was a very audacious move. The Al-Nida newspaper, the chief editor of this newspaper was our very close friend and colleague Sami Ghalib, a person who is extremely professional as a journalist and one who's extremely courageous. And proof of his professionalism is the fact that the newspaper that he was editor-in-chief of addressed this very contentious issue. The Al-Nida newspaper, led by Sami Ghalib, took the position of a professional journalist who takes a critical stance towards the issues that they discuss, as well as I'm sorry, Alawi. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you have 2 minutes left for your intervention. Oh, Samah is still not here, so I could take a bit more time. No, Samah is here. Oh, okay, then I'll try to wrap it up. I'll try to read it quickly. The Al-Nida newspaper would publish on a weekly basis a report on one of the victims of the enforced disappearance. And I used to at the time work in another newspaper in Ishara, and I wanted to try to find the name of this individual, a person that I have been looking for a quarter century. And I kept reading the newspaper to try to find
عبارة عن
any
واجهة
information on
تصل
him.
أحد ضحايا الاخطار
And
القسري.
a few months
عرفت
later,
القصة هذه
while I was reading about the
وهو
enforced disappearance, I
محمد علي
found
هادي.
his name. His
ورأيت
name was
وجهه
Muhammad
لأول
Ali
مرة،
Hadi, and
اسم
I was
الوجه
able to see
الرحيم
his
كنت
face
أحمله في وجداني
for
وذاكرتي
the first
طوال
time.
تلك
A
الأعوام.
victim that I had
عدت إلى
known
البيت
but did
مبكرا.
not know
أول
his
ما
name,
أنا
did not know
إلى
his
البيت
identity until then. And so I went home,
وفتحت لي أمي الباب ويبدو
and my
أنها
mother
لاحظت
opened the door, and I think she
بشيء ما
noticed
وتسألني
when
ما
she
لك
saw me that
أعطيتها
something was wrong. And so she asked me
الصحيفة. قلت
what
لها
had
نعم
happened, and I
أعطيتها
gave her the
الصحيفة
newspaper. I told her I was okay,
وهي مطوية على
but
صورة محمد علي هادي. قلت لها هذا
I
هو
gave her the
محمد الذي
newspaper and pointed out
حدثنا
Muhammad
عنه
Ali
أبي
Hadi, and I told
قبل
her that this
25 سنة.
was the
هنا
young man
طبعا
that my
أنا
father told us
سأختصر.
about
هنا
25 years before that.
دور
And this is
الصحافة
where the role of
في
journalism comes
توثيق
in. This is the role of
هذه الحالات.
journalism in
وأنا
documenting these
وقع علي
violations
شخصيا
and these
بأني
crimes. And
جعلتني
I
أعرف
personally experienced
اسم
this
صاحبي. طبعا هذا الأمر كنت
when I
أظن أنه
was able to
سيريحني
find out the
لكنه
name.
لم
And I
لم
thought that
يريحني.
this would bring me
وهذا جيد
peace,
أنه لم يريحني.
but that was not the case. And I think it was actually a
في
good thing that
في
it did not.
في سبتمبر
In
عام
September
2 عام 2012
of
أطلق المطرب الشاب
2012,
مراد
a
سبيع
young artist
حفلته التي
named
أسماها
Murad
الجدران
Subay
تذكر
launched a
وجوههم.
campaign,
وهنا أيضا
and this
نسلط
campaign was
الضوء
called The
على دور
Walls Remember
الفنون
Their
في
Faces. And this shines a light on
في
the role of the arts
في توثيق هذه
in
هذه
documenting
الذاكرة.
these
ويكفي أن
violations
نعرف أنه
and
اسم
memorializing the
الاسم
victims.
الجميل لهذه الحملة، العنوان هذه الحملة الجدران تتذكر
And
وجوههم.
this beautiful
وهذا العمل
campaign, The
وهذه
Walls
الحملة
Remember
كانت
Their,
فيها
their,
جموع
their Faces,
شباب
was a
ونساء
campaign that
وشرطة
many
موظفين
people
قسرا
participated
وكثير من
in, from the
المهتمين،
families of the
وتشع
victims and
أسبوعيا
many people who were
أسبوع بعد
interested
آخر
in this. And
يذكر
the campaign would expand
يذكر
week
المشاركين
after
في
week. More and more
هذه
people would
الحملة.
participate in it.
وترسم كل المجاميع المشاركة كانت ترسم
And all
وجوه
of the
المسيحيين في
participants
شوارع
would,
صنعاء أولا
as a part of
ثم
this
في شوارع
campaign, would
إب
paint the
وتعز
faces of the
وحصلت الحملة
forcibly
حوالي
disappeared on the walls in
122
Sana'a, then Ib
ضحايا
and Hudaydah
في
and other
فترة من
cities.
8 سبتمبر 2012
And from
إلى
September
3
September
أبريل
2012 until
2013.
April
أثناء رسم
2013,
الوجوه في
this
صنعاء
campaign
كنت أختار
continued.
وجه
And
صاحبي
while the faces were
المساهم
being put up
في
on the
إبراز
walls in Sana'a,
الجدران
I chose
كما
my
كانت صحيفة
friend, the
الشارع التي
person that
كنت
I
أعمل
had been
فيها
looking for,
تنقل
Muhammad Ali
في
Hadi.
وجه أحد
And the
الضحايا
Ashari newspaper
برسوم
where I
مراد
worked
سبيع
would
مع
also
خبر
publish some of
عن
the
موعد ومكان الحملة
pictures of the
الأسبوعية.
campaign as
في
well as
نهاية
the
يوم من
date
أيام
and
الحملة
time
في
of the
صنعاء
weekly activities.
طلب
And at the
مني
end of this campaign in
مراد سبيع
Sana'a,
أن
Murad
أرافقه
Subay
وبعض
asked
من
me,
شباب الحملة
along
للمطار
with some of the other
لأصل
young men
أكمل
participating in the campaign. Sorry, just
بنص دقيقة حتى
if you
نصل
could
إلى
just,
المستشفى. نص
if you
دقيقة
could
وأنا
please wrap it up in
أذهب.
half a minute, if you could.
طيب من شباب في منزل الأستاذ محمد الموفق
We had a
الزميل
meeting
العزيز
at the home of
محمد علي
Muhammad
هادي
al-Muwaffaq,
المعتقل
who was
ومن
someone who
مدينتي.
was close to
قائل
Muhammad Ali
ربما
Hadi and
يقول لي
also
مراد
from Ib.
ربما كان الأستاذ الموفق
And
قبل
Murad told me that maybe
وافد
al-Muwaffaq knew your
ورافقته.
father during the
رحب
time that he was
بالموفق
detained. And so
وخاطبني
I
طبعا
went
أخذ
there and
صورة
I
ورسلني
was
بالسلام
able to,
في مدة
when I was introduced to him,
وصورته في
al-Muwaffaq,
المعتقل.
he was very warm
أثنى
towards me and
كثيرا
he knew my father
على
during the
ودي أسأله فكرة
detention.
عن
And
العذاب
he
اللي كان
told us
يمر
about
وكذا وكذا
the
وكذا.
experience that he
أنا
had, his
بصدور
detention and how they were
سألته
tortured.
هل
And
كان
so I asked him
يعرف
if my
محمد علي
father
هادي؟
knew
نظر
Muhammad Ali
إلي
Hadi.
باستغراب
And he looked at me
وصرخ صوته
strangely
الحزين وهو
and
يخبرني
his
عن ما
voice
حوله
went up a little bit and he
وأخبرني
told me
جلوسهم
something.
أجلسوا بالبكاء
And he told
أمام
me
جدي.
something that
قال
made me
لي
cry in
يا
front of
علوي
everyone. He told me,
محمد مات تحت
Alawi,
طول عناء جراح أبيه
Muhammad
وهو في
died after
حضن
torture
أبيه
while in
وهو في
the
حضن أبيه.
arms of your father,
أعتقد
after
أنه
having
القصة
been returned to his cell.
تلخص
And so I think this
دور الصحافة
story, this
ودور الفنون
experience
وأيضا
summarizes
كان
the
يعتقد
important
أنه
role of
داخل الوسط
journalism and
الفني
of the
أيضا
arts,
العمل هذا
and
جيد.
also
شكرا
the
شكرا لكم
importance
وعفوا
of
إذا أخذت وقت.
these kinds of campaigns and initiatives. Sorry for taking so long. Back to you, Muhammad. Thank you very much, Alawi. This was an excellent experience, and I know that there are many others that are very important for us to share and discuss. And it was very important that this file, the file of the forcibly disappeared, was opened in this way in Yemen. And from that same perspective, we can also shine a light on the role of journalism and the media. And this and now we go back to Mrs. Samah Subay. Samah, some civil society organizations have worked to build collective efforts, including, and one of these collective efforts was the Yemen Declaration for Transitional Justice in 2023. And this was a declaration that you participated in drafting and in announcing in The Hague. And so can you please tell us more about the declaration? Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you for the invitation. And I would like to thank the audience for being here. With regards to civil society organizations and the role that they play,
العدالة
on
الانتقالية
transitional justice.
ربما أستطيع أن أقول أن دور المنظمات بدأ في السنوات
I
الأخيرة
believe
ربما
that the role of civil society
بشكل
organizations on this issue
هنالك فعاليات وهنالك نقاشات يدور حول هذا
started
الأمر بشكل وإن
with
كان بشكل
discussions
محدود،
and
لكنه
dialogues, and
يقدم
albeit
بادرة
limited,
ممتازة،
it has still been an
ونريد أن
excellent
يكون
step
الأمر
forward,
أكثر
and we
فعالية
hope that
بهذا
this
الشأن.
can be continued and
طبعا
that
في
these
العام
efforts can also be expanded.
2022
In
وتحديدا في السادس
2023,
والعشرين من
specifically
يوليو
on the
كان
26th of
هنالك
July,
بيان هام
there was a very
صدر عن
important
أكثر من 40 منظمة
statement that was issued by more than
مدنية
40
يمنية
Yemeni civil society
تجتمع كلهم
organizations,
لإصدار هذا البيان،
and all of them
والذي
worked
صيغ من أجل
collectively to issue
الحث
this
على أن يكون هنالك
declaration.
عدالة انتقالية
And the
منصفة
declaration was
لجميع
meant to ensure
ضحايا
that there would
الانتهاكات في
be
اليمن.
just and equitable
هذا
transitional
الأمر
justice for all of the victims
طبعا يعد
of
بادرة
violations in Yemen.
جيدة،
I believe that
كونه
this was an
يعمل على
excellent step
تعزيز مبدأ
as it
العدالة
works
الانتقالية.
to
نحن طبعا
instill the
لدينا
concept
مشكلة
of
كبيرة في
transitional
الوقت
justice. One of the
الحالي مع العدالة
challenges that we
الانتقالية
face in Yemen
كونها
whenever we discuss
امتعاج
transitional
بالمناسبة،
justice,
ليس
as it
فقط
is
من
a
ناحية
relatively
التحدث
modern
بالصراع،
concept,
ولكن
not
عندما
because
تحدث
we're
المناعة
relatively new to
للأسف
conflicts,
الشديد
but
عن الأمر
unfortunately, whenever there are any
بالطريقة فإنه بالنسبة
discussions,
لنا مفهوم جديد. طبعا هو
especially
مش
on
جديد تماما،
transitional justice,
لكنه
which
يعني تم
might
الحديث
be
مثل ما
seen as
قلت
a,
في السنوات الماضية
it's not
بشكل
completely new to
وطني،
Yemenis, but
لكن
there were discussions about it
كان
during the
هنالك
National
طبعا
Dialogue
كثيرة
Conference
ونقول
in 2012,
بدون
but there was
الدفاع عن هذا
outright
الموضوع،
rejection and
خصوصا
maybe even
لأولئك
vicious
الذين
attacks
الذين هم
against
معنيين
anyone who would
بالسياسة
speak about
والذين
this,
للأسف
especially by
هم من الملطخين
politicians
المقتولين
and political actors,
لدماء اليمنيين.
some of whose
لكن
hands or some of
كانت
whom
إعلان شركة
have been
البادرة
involved in these
إيجابيا،
crimes and
وربما هو
violations against Yemenis. But
سيكون
this
إذا
declaration was a very
استمرت
positive
الجهود
step and an excellent initiative, and if the efforts
يعني
continue,
أمر ممتاز نحو العدالة
it
الانتقالية
will be
التي
a very
نرجوها
positive
والعدالة
development
الانتقالية
towards
الفعلية
transitional
بمعناها
justice that we want in
الحقيقي
Yemen, a
على أرض
real
الواقع.
transitional justice that is
طبعا
implemented
كان قبل
on
هذا
the
الإعلان
ground.
قد
Before
أقيم
this declaration,
منتدى اليمن الدولي، والذي
the Yemen
ركز
International
كله
Forum was held,
يعني
and the
بالأساس
efforts of the
على
Yemen International Forum
الحديث عن
focused
العدالة الانتقالية،
primarily
وهذا
on
يعد بادرة
discussing
ممتازة
transitional justice, which
كونه
I
استمر،
also
لأن
believe
هنالك
was an
ضحايا لا
excellent
نستطيع أن
initiative
نتجاوزهم أو
because it
نقتصر
is important for
على
us
هذا
as
الأمر،
a way to
ولأنه
respond to the
نذهب إلى
victims. It is
سلام
impossible for us
وللأسف
to
هنالك
marginalize them and
أي
head
معالجة
towards
لهذا
peace for
الأمر.
Yemen without having resolved
فمشكلتنا
this file.
الآن هو أننا لم نعالج ملفات الماضي للأسف.
And one of our main problems in
ولذلك
Yemen is that
لكن
these
يظل
violations and these
كانت
grievances
محدودة
continue to
في نطاقها
accumulate.
النظري،
There are
وإن
efforts from civil
كانت
society,
التي
but they, like I
ربما
said,
نقول
they are
أنها
still limited and they
تعمل
are
على
still primarily theoretical
تعزيز
or
هذا المفهوم
conceptual
لدى
in nature,
الذهنية اليمنية،
while
يعني هذا
working
المفهوم
to
فقط
help
لدى
instill this
فئام في
concept
المجتمع خاصة العاملين في
among
التغير
Yemeni society
التديني.
in general,
فنحن
and not
نريد أن
just
يكون
those
لنا
working in
دبلوماسية إيجابية.
non-governmental organizations.
شكرا أستاذ سماح.
Thank you very much, Samah, for your answer.
أستاذ سماح هل تسمعي؟
Samah, can you hear me?
تفضل.
Yes, I can hear you.
شكرا لك.
Thank you very much, Samah.
إذا ننبه الأخوة
I would
الحاضرين
like to
أنه
inform
المجال مفتوح لهم
our
لتقديم
audience
أسئلتهم
that
أي
the floor is open now for any questions you might have for our
الأستاذ
panelists. But in the
السقاف.
meantime, I will go
أستاذ
back to
علوي
Mr. Alawi
يتحدثنا
Saqaf with another
عن
question.
أهمية دور الصحافة والفنون في
Alawi,
نقاش
can you
الضحايا.
tell us about the
لو سمحت
importance of journalism in the arts in memorializing victims? And if you
طيب
could do this briefly, please.
شوف هو كما قلت لك، كما قلت في السياق انه
As I said earlier,
أول صحيفة
the first
فتحت هذا الموضوع هي صحيفة
newspaper that discussed this
النداء.
matter
كانت
was the
من
Al-Nida newspaper.
2007
And starting in 2007, I believe, and the activities continued for months, I believe, where every week they would release a picture of one of the victims of enforced disappearance. And I think the beautiful thing about this campaign was that the campaign would try to be as neutral as possible, where it would not be affiliated politically, and it looked at this matter purely as a matter of rights without any political affiliation or leanings. And so the newspaper would show the victims, whether these are victims from the left or victims of the left or victims from any group or segment of society. And all of the stories that were published
طابع وطني، ده طابع
were
وطني
stories
بعيد عن أي
of a national
هذا الدور
nature
كان
or
لصحيفة النداء
without having any
في أروع ما يكون.
leanings or biases. And I think this was an excellent campaign in a way to memorialize the victims. And like I said, when I was in the Ashara newspaper, when we started publishing the newspaper on a daily basis, on the last page of the newspaper, we would allocate some space for one of the portraits of the forcibly disappeared as they had been drawn by the artist Murad Subay, and we would include information about where the campaign to draw the faces of the forcibly disappeared, where it would be that week. What I'm trying to say is that if there is a newspaper that has played a role in memorializing and in raising awareness about the forcibly disappeared and in documenting them, and these victims had been forgotten to a very large extent, except obviously by their families. But after this campaign by Nida, associations were formed and activity increased, and this reached its pinnacle with the February 2011 revolution.
ايش كان يسمى هذاك المؤتمر اللي كان في في المؤتمرات اللي كانت تتم في تلك الفترة،
and during the conferences that were conducted at the time,
كان تطرح العدالة الانتقالية.
The concept of transitional justice was being discussed, as well as the necessary legal framework and accountability and reparations and other legal issues. And I believe that the main reason for this was for the efforts that were by our dear colleague Sami Ghalib at the Al Nida newspaper, as well as other journalists for their work on this. Back to you, Muhammad.
هل تسمعونني كنتم؟
Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? Yes, we can hear you, Alawi. Thank you very much.
سمعتوني؟ اوكي.
Okay, thank you.
اوكي سمعناك. اذا عودة للسادة سماح.
Going back to Samah.
ما هي الأدوار التي يجب أن يطرحها
Samah,
المجتمع المدني؟
what roles do you think civil society should play in a victim-centered transitional justice process? With regards to the roles, there are some very important roles that civil society organizations can play. As civil society organizations have now taken the place of the state on many issues, and civil society organizations represent the conscience of many of the victims. And so there would need to be serious efforts to further these efforts, especially after the many years of conflict, of fragmentation, and of Yemenis being dispersed all over the world. We want transitional justice in a real sense, and starting with the raising awareness is a very important step, and that is one of the roles that civil society organizations can and are playing. And I believe that this is a very important step. But when we talk about transitional justice in its real meaning or its deep meaning, this would require efforts towards its implementation. And this starts with documentation. As it is said, documentation is what helps build the collective memory. And we cannot talk about rights, or we cannot talk about the rights of the victims or transitional justice unless we have been able to fully document these issues and to memorialize it and preserve it, whether for now or for a coming stage. And so this is the first role or the first step, which is documentation based on international standards and practices. Secondly, it's also important the role that civil society organizations play in training and building the capacity of personnel in different aspects, including, for example, lawyers, human rights activists, and others working on this field. It is important that we have a specialized cadre that are trained, and not in the way that is being provided now, where these trainings are being provided for a few days or a few weeks, and then things end. We need the training and the capacity building to follow a methodology, a clear methodology, so that it can be fruitful. Local Yemeni civil society organizations can also coordinate to establish a fund
يكون هنالك جبر لضرر الضحايا.
to help
هنالك
provide reparations to
أمور
the
يجب
victims.
إذا ما استطعنا أن نقوم بمسألة الملاحقة القضائية وهو أمر
And
بالنسبة
if
لليمن
we can
إذا
pursue
التنفيذ من الناحية
accountability, and
القانونية
if we
يكون
look at
صعوبة
this
جدا
from the legal
ويحتاج
perspective in
إلى
Yemen, this
كذلك
will be
الصدقة على
very
الاتفاقيات
difficult, and it will
المهمة،
require Yemen first
جهود
ratifying certain
بناء أموال
international
طائلة.
conventions, and this will
التفرقة
require
بين
significant funds.
يأتي
But if that is not
بشكل جد
possible,
بسيط بما يسمى جبر
we
ضرر
must
الضحايا
at least work on
وذلك
providing
بحقوقهم.
reparations to
هنالك
the victims
ناس
and restoring their rights. There are people
ممتلكاتهم
whose property,
منازلهم
for example, was confiscated, their
منطقهم
homes,
وعقاراتهم،
their
وهنالك
assets were taken from
أناس
them,
آخرين
and there
تم
are others
تهجيرهم من مناطقهم
who were
وتهجيرهم
displaced
قسرا.
from their homes or
هنالك ما
from the
يسمى
areas that they
للأسف اليوم
resided in,
ملف ما
and they were
يسمى
forced to
الأسرى،
leave. There are
وهم
also the
أغلبيتهم
people,
من المدنيين
most of whom are
يتم التعامل
civilians and who
معهم
have
على
been
أنهم
detained or abducted,
يعني
but are being negotiated as a part
الذين
of the prisoner exchange
يعني
file,
كجبهات
unfortunately,
للأسف.
and they're
طبعا
being
هنالك
treated
مفاهيم
equally
مغلوطة
to those
كثيرة
who were
في
captured on the
الصراعات
front lines.
الداخلية عادة.
Usually in
ليس
local
هنالك
conflicts
مثلا
or internal conflicts,
أسرى وإنما هم محتجزين
these
أسرى
are not
داخل أرض
called
القضية.
prisoners, they're called
الاتفاقية الثالثة المشتركة
detainees,
الاتفاقية
and
الملحقة باتفاقية جنيف،
and
ومع ذلك
they
يتعاملون
then the
معهم.
third
لماذا أصر
additional
على هذا
protocol of the
الموضوع؟
Geneva Conventions
لأن
applies to
للأسف
them.
الأسير
And why is
بيعاني
this
من
important?
يسقط
Because when we
الحق
talk
له
about prisoners
بالمحاربة
of war,
وبعد ذلك ضد هؤلاء الجناه.
they
هنالك مدنيين
if they're
تم
treated
سجنهم
as
بهذا
prisoners
الأمر
of war,
وتم
they lose a
التمادر
lot of their
ضدهم
rights. There
وسقطت
are
حقهم
civilians
أمام
who were
عدالة
included,
المحاربة.
and they were
لدينا
exchanged, but
كذلك
they will lose out on the rights if they are
الكثير
part
من
of a
القضايا
prisoner
بين
exchange
بقية
deal.
المختفين
There are
قسرا.
many other issues. There are the
فهنا
issues of
يجب
those who
على
have been forcibly
الصورة
disappeared. And
البسيطة
here,
أن
at
نقول
least
جبر ضرر،
at the very
ومن
basic
ذلك
level,
أيضا
we must work towards
العمل
providing
على مثلا
reparation while
لكل
also
يوم
working
للضحية
to,
اليمني،
for example,
ويكون بشكل دوري
establish
وفعلي
a day
ويستمر
for Yemeni
حتى مع
victims,
انتهاء
and
الحرب.
that this would
يعني
continue
كانت
even
هنالك
after
الكثير
the
من
conflict
التجارب
ends.
مثل التجربة
Based on what I've
العنيفة
seen
التي
from
كانت تشهد
different
أنفسنا
experiences, including the
الحرب اليمنية،
Rwandan experience,
لكنهم
which was
أصروا
much
أن
more
يدخلوا
violent and
المعالجات.
brutal than the
لماذا؟
Yemeni
لأن
conflict,
هنالك
but they were able to find
احترام
solutions
مشترك في
for it
اليمن،
because
لأنه لا
they
يوجد
had the
إرادة
will.
حقيقية.
And that is the
الكل
real
مستفيد
problem
من
that we
الحرب
have in Yemen.
للأسف،
There
لكن
is no real
نحن
will to deal with it.
كعاملين
Everyone is
لدينا
benefiting from
ومن
the
لدينا ضمير
conflict.
إنساني
But
حقيقي
we, as
يجب
civil
أن يعمل بقدر
society,
ما يستطيع.
we who have this
ويحاول
conscious need
نظرة
to do
الإله
everything we can
التنظيرية.
and take the
يجب
steps
أن
that we
يكون
can
هنالك عمل
without
تحقيقي
continuing to
لهذا المجال.
remain
هنالك
in
قضايا
the
يمكن
theoretical
تنقلها
aspect
بشكلها
of it.
الفردي
There are
عبر
cases that can be
كلمة
submitted
خواص.
individually through the
وأنا
UN
أعلم
special
تماما
reporters.
كمحامية أن الأمر فيه
And as a
صعوبة،
lawyer, I know that
لكن
there are
ضروري لهذا
difficulties and it's
الجلسة
not
وأن
easy.
العمل
But if we
الأناني
all work together and if we work
ولا نريد أن نتحدث
selflessly
حول مؤسسات أو حول
for the
عنصر،
rights of the
يعني
victims,
ممكن نحن نتفق
I think that this is
لعمل
something that
جاد
we can achieve
كعلى
this,
غرار
and we
إقليمي.
can
بالطبع
agree to
هنالك
very
رواندا
serious work that we
كموقف،
can do
هنالك
together. Like
كينيا،
Rwanda, for
هنالك
example, or even Kenya.
الأرجنتين التي لديها
What was done in
35 ألف
Argentina,
مسجون
for
قسرا،
example, where there were
وحاولت قدر
35,000
اليسير
individuals who had been
حاول
forcibly
أن يدرس
disappeared,
أن
and they
يوم
tried
خاص على غراره. طبعا
to
يوم 30
preserve
من
the rights of the
أغسطس،
victims by
وبالمناسبة هم من أسروا
establishing a
أكثر
day for the
بشكل
forcibly disappeared,
فعلي.
and
هنالك
the August
الإحياء
30th being the
ذكرى
day of
هؤلاء
the
الضحايا،
International Day
ولذلك
of the
نحن
Forcibly
كيمنيين
Disappeared was primarily
كثير
due
من
to
القضايا
Argentinian efforts.
نعمل عليها
And I
ونساهم
know that
فيها.
we have
لا
many
يتم
issues
الأمر
that we've been
بشكل
working on,
بسيط.
but we must try to
هنالك
expand
كذلك
and further develop it
النصب التذكارية
and the role that
تعمل
civil
عليها.
society can
يبقى
play.
الآن
There's
نحن
also
نريد
the issue
الآن ليس
of
فقط
monuments
كما
to
قلت
memorialize the victims, and
بمسألة
all of these steps
الطرق
are steps
الشرعية
that can
مهمة
start
جدا،
now. Yes, awareness raising is very
ويتم
important,
توضيح مفهوم ما تعنيه
and it's
العدالة.
also
هنالك
very
ناس كثير
important to clarify what exactly
لدى الفكر.
justice means in this
نحن عندنا
context,
مشكلة
because
نظل
there's a
نقول
lack of
أو
understanding
نختلف
on,
في
on
بعض
many
الأشياء
levels
التي هي
when
ليست
it comes to
جذرية.
this. And I think
المساواة
in many
ليس
cases, the
ضروريا
differences that we have are
نظل
not at the core
نتناقش.
of the topic.
هنالك
It's not
عمل يجب
important
أن
for us
يكون
to
خطوات
focus
يجب
solely on
وضعها
discussing the
في منتصف.
terminology or what terms will be used. There need to be real practical steps that are taken. Thank you.
شكرا أستاذ سماح.
Thank you very much, Samah.
لدينا بعض من الأسئلة عن
We
الجمهور
have
في
some
الشارع
questions
في
from the
السودان.
audience. There was a
مروان
question
الشيباني
from
يقول كيف
Marwan
يرى ضحايا
al-Shaybani,
الاختطاف القسري في
in which
اليمن
he says, how do
فعالية
the
وجدوى إجراءات العدالة الانتقالية مثل
what
كشف
what do
الحقيقة
victims
الاستفادة
in Yemen think
والإصلاح
about
المؤسسي لمعالجة
the
معاناتهم الشخصية
steps
والجماعية،
of
وهل يرون أن
transitional
هذه
justice and
الإجراءات
resolving
قادرة
these
على استعادة
issues?
ثقتهم
And do they
وعودة ضمان
believe
عدم
that
تكرار
these
الجريمة
measures can help
وإصابة
restore their trust in the state, and that there would be non-repetition of these violations. Over to you, Samah. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is very important, and and revealing the truth is one of the most important ways or one of the most important measures to be implemented with these files. For many of the victims who had passed away while while under enforced disappearance, we won't be able to bring them back to life, but at least revealing their fates, where they were being held, and where they are now. The families of these victims want to know what happened to their children. One of the most famous stories that we have to illustrate this point is what happened to Al-Qirshi, who was forcibly disappeared decades ago, and his family still does not know what happened to him. And one of the most famous journalists who are still forcibly disappeared is Wahid al-Sufi, and no one knows where Wahid is being held, and we don't see that there is sufficient focus or even interest in his case. And for these victims, it's important for their fates to be revealed. And this is one of the most important components of transitional justice. There cannot be transitional justice without the fates of these victims being revealed, and this is one of the solutions. Also, the issue of accountability. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to accountability. We have accountability at its basic level. And as a lawyer, I don't want just accountability. I want legal prosecution for these criminals that have committed these very heinous crimes without any sort of conscience or morals that would stop them from committing them. And like I said, as a lawyer, I want transitional justice and I want legal prosecution, but I fully understand the obstacles that we will face in this. And so there would need to be at least truth-seeking reparations for the victims and a reminder that there are victims whose rights have been violated, and we cannot have a real, just, and sustainable peace without resolving these issues. Thank you very much, Samah. Going back to Alawi Saqaf, there's a question from one of the attendees, and he is asking about what the challenges are facing journalism and the arts in memorializing victims, and how can these obstacles be overcome? Thank you very much, Muhammad, and I would like to thank the person who asked the question for this question. Unfortunately, during the war, there is no longer any real journalism. There are some smaller scale operations, but there are, and unfortunately, most of the media organizations are closely affiliated with different political actors and cannot be considered neutral by any means. And I think one of the main obstacles is the culture that we have in Yemen. Our culture in Yemen, we have not worked to develop an individual conscience, but have focused on a collective conscience where people would feel empathy for people from their areas or from their tribes and what they have gone through, and they would try to find someone, anyone who had violated the rights of someone that they are close to. But for us to have our own individual consciences, and this is something that I believe to a large extent is missing, which is a conscience that would feel empathy to any human suffering and consider this suffering to be shared suffering that we all must work to stop. And this is where the role of journalism comes in, as well as the role of what Samah mentioned, the role of awareness raising and memorializing the victims. This can be done through monuments, through school curriculums, and through days for memorialization. And memorialization in this context is all of our duty. It's our moral responsibility. There cannot be a democratic future in one where people are respected as civilians. This cannot be achieved without transitional justice. This cannot be achieved without uncovering the truth and revealing the fates of these victims. This will help decrease the burden to a large extent and help us move forward to a democratic future. But I would like to reiterate that there cannot be democracy and there cannot be equality without transitional justice. Thank you.
شكرا أستاذ
Thank you
علوي.
very much, Alawi.
هناك سؤال آخر للأستاذة سماح
There is another question for
مروان
Samah
الشيباني ويقول
from
بارك
Marwan
الله
al-Shaybani.
ما العوامل السياسية والأمنية
And
والاجتماعية
he
التي
asks,
تعرقل إنصاف ضحايا الاغتيال القسري والاحتجاز في
realistically,
الجماعة
what
طول الوقت عن
political,
القسم
security, and social
والمعاناة في البلاد.
factors hinder justice for victims of enforced
عفواً،
disappearance and detention in Yemen, given the divided or fragmented and complex reality of the country?
أوكي.
Could you please repeat the
مروان
question,
الشيباني
Muhammad?
يسأل يقول
Marwan al-Shaybani
ما
asks,
العوامل السياسية
realistically,
والأمنية
what
والاجتماعية التي
political,
تعرقل
security,
إنصاف
and
ضحايا
social
الاغتيال القسري
factors hinder justice for
والاحتجاز في
victims of
الجماعة
enforced
طول الوقت عن
disappearance and
القسم
detention in
والمعاناة
Yemen,
في البلاد؟
given the fragmented and complex reality of the country?
هذا الأمر بالذات ملف المختفين
Yeah,
قسرا
unfortunately,
هو
this file,
من
especially the file of the
طبعا هذه
forcibly
جريمة
disappeared,
من
this is a
أسوأ
crime.
الجرائم اللي
This is one
ارتكبت
of the
صعوبتها.
most heinous, if not the most heinous crime.
بالنسبة لليمن هناك صعوبات
And for
كبيرة
Yemen, there are many challenges
يعني متعلقة مصادقة
from
على هذه
enforced
الاتفاقية،
disappearance. There were
لكن
efforts
حال
to
ذلك
ratify this
الأمر
agreement, this
دون
convention,
المصادقة
but
عليها
unfortunately, the
كون
process was
العامل
never
أو النقود
completed
السياسيين
because the
خايفين من هذا
political
الأمر.
actors all felt
كثير منهم
that they would have a
للأسف متورطين في
responsibility.
انتهاك
Many
هذه
of the
الاتفاقات. كان
political
هم
actors are involved in these
النقود
violations.
الذي جعلهم يعارضون مثل
And
هذا
so this
الأمر.
is what led to them opposing
فلذلك
any
نحن
steps to
نحتاج
ratify the
إلى
convention by Yemen.
كثير من العمل، ولذلك أقول أن هذا
And so
الذي الآن
we need,
حاليا يقوم
there are
على
many
عاتق
steps
المنظمات
that are
المجتمع
needed.
المدني
And this is
كل
why I said that this is the
العاملين من صحفيين
responsibility
وغير
of civil
موجودين من
society,
صحفيين من حقوقيين
including
محامين
journalists, including
أبناء المجتمع
lawyers,
المدني
human rights
ككل
defenders, and
الضحايا
activists, all
كذلك
Yemenis, as well as the victims.
يعني العمل والضغط على أن تكون العدالة الانتقالية.
And their responsibility is to pressure towards transitional justice. It's important for Yemen to ratify this agreement, and this will only be possible if we have a state and state institutions are present. Also, for legal prosecution, this is something else that would be needed. And so if we say that we want legal prosecution, we would first need to have ratification of this agreement and then operationalization of the national Yemeni judicial system. And then if there are cases that would need further follow-up, they can be referred to international courts. But there are other methods, and they're also complicated. We have the UN special reporters, for example, and these special reporters, and this would require significant efforts from the individuals working in this field so that they can prepare these case files and submit them individually.
كان هنالك صعوبة لأنه في كثير من الحالات عندما حركت كثير من القضايا يا أما تدخل.
In many cases, when these files were pushed forward, this could be done through a Security Council resolution, which would be very difficult for Yemen, and also by Yemen ratifying these conventions. And the third step, like I said, is working through the UN special reporters, like the special reporter on the forcibly disappeared. And if the victim is in a country that has ratified the Rome statutes of the ICC, and if the perpetrator was in one of the countries there, this could be possible, but there are difficulties in pursuing this path. And like I know the complications or the difficulties that we face, but we can say that transitional justice, the first step would need to be recognition of the victims and also establishing a day for the victims. And this would help give them a form of reparations or compensation. Also establishing funds through work with international actors involved in Yemen. And there could even be a select number of cases. Unfortunately, because we have not done enough to prepare for this period, the less we prepare, the more difficult it will be. But the issue of documentation is very important, and it is a role that can be played now. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Samah. Samah, there's another question from Hisham Yusufi, who is a journalist and someone who had been imprisoned by the Houthis. He asks, what role do victims themselves need to play in pursuing transitional justice, and what complementary role can civil society organizations play so that justice is not just from a legal perspective, but also covers the humanitarian or the human and the human rights dimensions. Could you please answer this question in less than a minute if you can? With regards to the victims, it's important for their involvement. There cannot be transitional justice without victims being a part of it, meaning that there would have to be at least from what I've seen from other experiences, that victims would be a part of this process and its design. They would be provided, for example, with training. They would be provided with
دعم نفسي،
the
تدريب
necessary
لهم، تعاطي
psychosocial support.
تدريبات.
They could be given,
كل هذا
for
الموضوع
example,
يمارس
trainings,
معنويا ما
and so that
يتم كما قلت
and that's from
يتم بناء على
the moral support that can be given to
أمور
them. When it
متعلقة
comes to
بحدود ملفات
reparations, this would
قرب انتهاء
require
المحاكمة.
a
منظمات
real
المجتمع
an
المدني
accountability. This
بصدد
would
عمل
require
كثير
legal case
أيضا
files. Civil
بالتوثيق
society
والتدقيق.
organizations can
بعد
do a
ذلك
lot, and it's important for them to work on documentation, but then also continuing to remind
حتى
everyone
بشكل
of the
لا
importance of
نفترض لا
transitional
سلبيا،
justice and
ممكن يكون
awareness
إيجابيا،
raising.
ممكن
And
يكون
it doesn't have to be done on an
إيجابي
annual
بنفس
basis.
الوقت.
It could be
أنا
done more
أعتقد أن
regularly or
الكل
through any other
شيء
format.
ما تعني
But I
العمل
think this will help
الانتقالي
everyone
هو
understand
رد
what
محلول.
exactly
أنا هناك
transitional justice
سلبت من
means. That
هؤلاء
what it means at the
يجب
end of the day is that there
يجب
are
الاعتراف
rights that
بها
were
على
taken
الأقل
from these
بصورتها
individuals, and it's important
البسيطة.
for them to be restored and for the violations to be recognized and for the victims to be
شكرا أستاذ
recognized
سماح.
as well.
كمان
Thank you.
سؤال
Thank
موجه
you very
أيضا
much, Samah.
لك أنت والأستاذ
There's
علوي
another
السقاف،
question that is directed to you and to Alawi
وممكن علوي
Saqaf.
السقاف يجاوب عليه
And
في دقيقة، وأنت
Alawi
بعد
Saqaf could
ذلك
answer it in
تجاوب
half a
عليه.
minute,
يقول
and then we can give you an
فوزي
opportunity to answer it.
مهيوب:
And
هل عدم
Fawzi
إقامة
Mahyoub
جلسات جديدة
asks,
لتقليل
will,
التمايزات وما أنتجته الحرب من فوارق
will
من
transitional
القوانين
justice be enough to reduce the disparities and deep social divisions caused by the war, from your perspective?
عفوا شو تجاوب يا استاذ
I'm
سماح؟
sorry, would you like to start, Samah, or
لا
should I
عفوا
start? No, go ahead, Alawi.
أنا
Thank you.
أقول أيوه
I think, yes, it is.
العملية
Transitional justice
ممكن تعمل هذا الشيء، لأنه
can do that, can be enough to reduce these
إحنا
disparities.
مشكلتنا
Our
إنه
problem
الماضي السياسي السابق
is that our political
ما
history
زال ما زال فاعل، ما زال
continues to
فاعل
play an
سياسي.
active
بالعدالة
role
الانتقالية
in
الذي
our current politics. But with
سيحصل
transitional justice, what will happen?
من
What will happen is that there will be a
في
sort of
بيننا
transition
وبين الماضي.
from
يصبح
this
الماضي
present that is affected by the past
فقط،
to the
وسنبدأ
future, where
مرحلة
the past will
سياسية
only be a memory, and we will start a new political
الماضي
stage
ما
in
زال
our history.
بكل ضحاياه
But if the
بكل
past, with all of its
الانتهاكات التي
victims, with
حصلت
all of its
فيه
violations, with all of its
وكل
grievances,
الانتهاكات
continues to be active and
لكرامة
continues
الإنسان بما هو
to play a
إنسان
role, with all of the
وسنمره
violations
معنا إلى
against
اليوم
human dignity, and if this
وهذا
continues
لا
to be a
يخفف
burden
لا
that we
لا
bear,
لأي أحد
then we will
لا
not be able
للضحايا
to achieve
ولا لنا
justice,
نحن
not
أيضا
for the victims or not for the rest of the
سنصبح
country.
مرشحين لنصبح ضحايا كل فرد
And the
عدالة
scope of the
انتقالية
victims will
يرتكب أي
continue to expand. Any individual without transitional justice can be a future victim, because these
مع أي تغيير سياسي
these
هناك
practices or these behaviors will continue with any sort of political shifts or changes. There will continue to be violations of people's dignity and detentions, etc. But through transitional justice, we will be able to fully transition from this stage so that it becomes solely a memory, one that we continue to memorialize so that it is not repeated in the future. Thank you.
ممكن أستاذ سماح تجاوب على السؤال
Thank you
بشكل
very
بسيط؟
much, Alawi. If Samah, if you could answer this question also briefly. Like Alawi has said, when there is transitional justice, this will help us transition and move on from the past, meaning that we'll be able to stop many of the violations or ensure their non-repetition. And it's very clear that with impunity, people will continue with this behavior. If there is real accountability and transitional justice that helps reveal the fates of these victims and holds these perpetrators accountable in the eyes of Yemeni society as well as the international community, this will be sufficient to ensure that we do not have the repeated cycles of violence in Yemen. Unfortunately, because we have not resolved the issues of our past, every 5 or 10 years we continue to have different rounds of cycles of violence, and this will only continue if it is not resolved. Thank you very much, Samah. I would like to inform our audience that we will have an additional 5 minutes in addition to the allocated time. so that we can continue with answering some of the questions that were presented. Marwan Shaybani also has an additional question. What is the biggest challenge that the media faces when dealing with the forcibly disappeared? Is it access to information or dealing with political pressure or raising awareness? Alawi, if you could please help us answer this question very quickly.
أنا لم أسمع.
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question.
الأستاذ مروان الشيباني يسأل
Marwan
ما
Shaybani
أبرز التحديات التي
asks,
تواجه
what
وسائل
are the
الإعلام
biggest challenges that
عن تناول هذا
the
الحديث
media
بطريقة
or
منفصلة،
journalists face
سواء
when dealing
من
with the
حيث
forcibly
الوصول إلى
disappeared?
المعلومات
Is
والقنوات
it
التقنية
access
أو
to
التفاعل مع
information?
القوى
Is it
السياسية
ensuring
والاجتماعية؟
neutrality or dealing with political and social pressure?
تمام. هذا سؤال لي طبعا.
Did you want me to answer
أعتقد
this question, Muhammad? Yes,
هذا
if you could, please.
أوكي
Okay.
أقول الأشياء اللي تعيق الأمر
The challenges facing the media when it comes to covering this issue, the issue of the forcibly disappeared, is that many of the families of the victims of enforced disappearance have continued to remain silent. They continue to be afraid and do not want to publicize the victims who had been forcibly disappeared. And I know there are many families. So, for example, the women who have been forcibly disappeared, and their families do not want to present these cases to the media or to the art campaigns like the campaign run by Murad Subaya. And this is one of the social challenges that we face. Another challenge is that the authorities the authorities or state institutions have not fully tried to resolve these files or allowed the media to address these matters. I believe that these two challenges are the biggest challenges that the media faces when dealing with when the media or the arts try to address the problem of enforced disappearance. Whether it is coverage by journalists or through innovative art campaigns like the one by Murad Subaya. In addition to what I mentioned earlier, which is that many people will say, what does this have to do with me? This has nothing to do with me. People who are not related to any victims might think that this is something that does not concern them. And this is one of the problems that I spoke about earlier, that we need to all feel that this suffering is all of our suffering. And it is also in all of our interest that this suffering is and these violations are not repeated, because if this continues and if there is no accountability, we will be future victims of these practices. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Samah, for your time. Thank you, Alwi Saqaf. I would like to also thank our audience for their time and for the engagement. Unfortunately, we did not have sufficient time to continue. Otherwise, we would have continued with this discussion. And I think it is a very important one on a very important and very complex file that we are facing as Yemenis.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, Alawi and Samah. We have one final session today. It will be in around half an hour, and it will be titled Pathways to Transitional Justice in Yemen, Local Leadership and Supporting International Mechanisms. The speakers for the session will be Nabil Abdel Hafiz, Deputy Minister of Human Rights, Marijke Verde, a Dutch diplomat and former Deputy Ambassador of the Netherlands to Yemen and transitional justice expert, and Arwa Fadl, who is a human rights activist and field researcher at the National Commission to investigate alleged violations of human rights. The moderator of the session will be Leila Shabibi, member of the YPF and executive director of the To Be Foundation for Rights. To our audience, this is not just the beginning of Transitional Justice Week, but it is an important platform for us to affirm our continued support for this file and to empower youth and civil society so that they can continue to work on this process. I'm sorry, Mohammed. I had one final, Mohammed, if you'll allow me. Yes, go ahead, Alawi. I had one final point I wanted to make. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Sami Ghalib for the role that he played in bringing these files to the light.
الشاب الرائع الفنان
As well
مراد
as
سبيع. أقول
I also
مراد
wanted to thank
إنه
Murad
عمله
Subayr for
هو
his
عمل
excellent
غير
efforts.
عادي.
His art
برافو
campaign was an
مراد
extraordinary
وسامي
initiative,
الحقيقة
and the
عملوا
work that
عمل
Murad
غير
and
عادي.
Sami
شكرا.
worked on were extraordinary efforts, and I would like to thank them for it.
شكرا جزيلا
Thank you
لكم
very
وإلى
much,
اللقاء
Alawi,
في
and thank you
بعد
everyone,
الساعة.
and see you in our
إن شاء
next
الله
session.
بعد نص ساعة. والى آخره.
Goodbye.
شكرا. كنا تمام. ايوه ايوه، هذا هو الافتراضي هو. شوف، انا لا اعرف اتكلم بالتلفون، لا اعرف